Hey, this is Todd. Happy Saturday, though recording this during the whole coronavirus quarantine, the days run together. I feel like these days it's just days that I have to log in and work versus days that I don't. But this is a Saturday. Yesterday I dropped a free one-page PDF, well, 2 pages once you include the license information, the OGL stuff, onto my Patreon. I will drop a link to that in the description. And what I had posted was a unique or unusual hex feature. In this case, it was called a grove of red delirium, and it was essentially a grove of trees that had a very peculiar bloom cycle. And when these trees bloom, they release a pollen, and the pollen has some effects. So it was essentially something your party could run into. I envisioned that you could just drop it into your campaign if you're running a hex crawl and you wanted something a little bit different to break up the potential monotony of going through a standard environment. This is something you could drop in there. Your players could see it. They could interact with it. You could have some fun with it. And that's pretty much what I wanted to have this video about today, was about a way you can spice up your hex crawl or your wilderness travel portions of your campaign, and that is by introducing unusual, unique, peculiar features to different hexes. Depending on your style of campaign, you probably don't want to have every hex be something weird and crazy, unless you're running a very gonzo type of campaign, in which case maybe the expectation is that every hex is going to be something weird and crazy. However, when you notice, if you look on a map, say you pull out the Middle Earth map and look at it, you'll see something like Mirkwood, and it's a huge amount of hexes, and they all essentially say forest. You're running a campaign like that, and we need to get to the other side of Mirkwood. If you remember from The Hobbit, you had different things happen. There was, if they'd gone way to one end, there was Dol Guldur, which is where Sauron was hanging out as the necromancer. If they went in another direction, there were the elves, and then there were the spiders. So you can see that each part of Mirkwood had some kind of a unique or unusual thing there, right? Something of interest. They may not want to interact with it. In the case of the spiders, certainly the hobbits and Bilbo didn't want to interact with them, but they were there, and it forced some interesting interactions. The elves, who knows if they had come across the elves under different circumstances. Maybe that might have been more of a social aspect. In the case of what it ended up being, was more of a stealth thing. I think there was some social mixed in. It's been a while since I read The Hobbit. I think I keep wanting to say Frodo. Bilbo does interact with the elves somewhat, but he ends up having to stealth out and trick the elves and free the dwarves. And of course, if they'd gone down the path of meeting Sauron, probably the Hobbit would have ended up very differently as a tale. So you can see that there you have this big area. First glance, it might look, it's just woods, and outside of the normal random encounters, it's going to be kind of boring. I'm going to be bored with the GM. My players are going to be bored as I just keep talking about woods, and well, how am I going to keep, once I've described the first bunch of trees in the woods, how can I really make them more interesting? So one way, which I'm not going to cover in this video, but maybe I can in another one, is adding some of the details. Some different reference books are great at having tables where you can draw up specific things about the vegetation or about the physical landscape, things that wouldn't show up on your hex map. For instance, when you look at a hex map, it's going to have just a symbol of a tree. You're going to have to put all of that in. And I have other videos about hex crawling specifically where I get into kind of, if you want to drill down and look at, well, it's mostly forest, but there could be other features in there. What are those? But another way to do it is to look at it and say, okay, this particular hex of forest is different. So in the case of that grove of red delirium that I posted yesterday, the idea is that this particular hex of woods, or it could be anything really, is a little bit different. And that different thing is something that you can draw to as a focus for a session or a part of a session. And like anything with hex crawl, your players may see that and say, you know what, we're beelining the other direction, right? That looks unusual. We don't want unusual, and that's fine. And you shouldn't force it. I would say with all this stuff, like I've said before about pretty much everything with hex crawl, don't try to force it. You put up this grove of red delirium in front of your players, and they see the blooms, and they get that kind of weird feeling like, this is not right. We're going to go well around that. Hey, great. They're potentially paying a price if there are time constraints. Maybe they're extending that. Obviously, if they're going out of their way, that might provoke more random encounter checks, which could end up going against them. There's all kinds of ways you can have consequences if the path that's the fastest path takes them to an area they don't want to go to. They decide to go around. There are consequences. So give them that. Don't force it. But they might be intrigued by it. They might be interested. They might look at it as an opportunity. Maybe there's some kind of treasure there. I am working on a longer version of that handout. So the one I sent is just a little one pager. I'm gonna have a longer one for patrons. So if you're interested in that, you know, join the Patreon. I think the regular tier is just $1 a month. So if you want to join that, I'll be coming up with a longer one hopefully soon that will give a little more interesting ideas of ways you can play with that beyond just the general sense that I gave in the one pager. But I think the one pager is totally, it's not gimped in any way. It has everything you need. But they might see something like, oh, this is interesting. Maybe there's treasure. Maybe there's some kind of other, treasure in the forms of actual loot, or treasure in the form of maybe there's something interesting. Maybe there's something we can use to our advantage. Maybe there's a connection we can make there. Maybe there, who knows? Maybe they just want to check it out out of curiosity. Players are definitely curious about things often, so you can play with that, but don't force it. So you have an area, and one thing that I think is really interesting. One thing that I think is really interesting is the concept of planar portals and connections that might sprinkle through the world. I don't mean like, oh, this one goes to Pandemonium, this one goes to the Nine Hells, this one goes to the City of Brass. I mean more to those elemental planes. Because if you think about it, one of the interesting things I found with the elemental planes is that, to me, that's how a lot of strange creatures can come into the world. So if we were going to use a real world example, and let's say we take Loch Ness.
Dance, come and dance with me, hear the beat of the pounding sea. Ride, baby, ride, come and ride with me, let your feet go easy.
Okay, Loch Ness Monster. Where does it come from? Why do people see it off and on, but there's clearly not enough food there? There's nothing for it to eat. There's no really way in. There's no way out. I mean, I know technically there is, but just bear with this example, right? Because I know it does. There is a feeder from the sea that comes into the loch. I don't know if it was a huge sea serpent, how easily you'll be able to get through there undetected, but whatever. For the purposes of let's say it's a completely landlocked lake. How does it get in there? How does it get out? How does it manage to be hidden? Well, the idea would be that maybe somewhere in the lake, the loch, there is a portal to a connection to the elemental plane of water. So when Loch Ness Monster disappears for 20 years, 30 years, it's just gone back through there into the elemental plane of water. Maybe it's popping out in another lake somewhere. Maybe Nessie and Ogopogo, or what's the one, Champy in Lake Champlain. Maybe they're all the same beast, just using tunnels through the elemental plane of water to get from one to the other. Maybe in the mountains there is some kind of a special cloud or something there that creates a passable, a permeable, I want to come with another word than portal, but membrane with the elemental plane of air. So all kinds of things could come through if you think of what creatures might live in the elemental plane of air most of the time, but then make forays periodically into the world. That's how they can get there. I always think about that. How do monsters that are somewhat unique or very rare, where are they living? Where are they breeding? Where are they coming from? Where could they possibly live in a world that maybe is mostly, if not occupied, then monitored and explored? And it could be that they're coming from these other planes. I always felt that way about goblins and things, that they're really from the Feywild, that they're kind of part of the greater Fey world, but that periodically there are incursions where great populations will migrate or push forward through into our world. And that's where you can get these goblins showing up in places you think they shouldn't be here, but they're here. How did they get here? How did they get around all this stuff? Well, it's because a portal opened up in some woods or some other desolate place, and the goblins, orcs, whatever, they poured in. Maybe they did it purposefully, maybe they were driven. Who knows? That's something you can play with, but that's how they got there. So you have these elemental planes, or really, again, Feywild, or any kind of wilderness, right? Tir Nanog, or however you want to call it, these different areas could all come in and have interesting interactions with your world. Think about, maybe there's they always have in Arthurian tales and different things, like the pond that's in the woods, and it's always weird, right? What's this weird thing with the pond? Well, maybe the pond has a water horse, and this is one of those nasty water horses that trying to lure unsuspecting people into the pond. But you'd think, well, it's just a little pond in the woods. It should be shallow. It should be nothing to it. How deep could it possibly be? Well, maybe it really is, again, one of these portals into the elemental plane of water. And so you step in deep enough and you just get sucked on down. And that's what, that's how that water horse operates. That's how things disappear in the woods. That's why people stay away. So it's an interesting element. One is the interaction part of it. It's a connection to the elemental plane, and you could use that to your advantage. If you remember that as a party, in those woods, there's a pond, there's a little tarn that leads to the plane of water. When we're low level, that just scares the bejesus out of us, and we don't want to go near it again. Maybe you can even work that into your campaign, where later on they need to go to the elemental plane of water, or maybe they need to go a really long distance, and they have something that they can use to navigate, to say, okay, if we go into the elemental plane of water in this little tarn over here, we're going to show up, we can navigate over and end up over on this other spot over here. So we've made a little connection, right? It's almost like a little wormhole, a little fantasy wormhole, fantasy way of warping through the around the planet. And it's not using magic per se, it's using these planar connections. If you think of these different planes are all connected, they all have little tendrils that are reaching out and touching these other planes. Think of all these places on your world where these elemental planes touch, and think about how creatures might get around. And you can use it as a plot point, you can use it as just a thing of interest. You know, it could just be a curiosity. It definitely could be a reason for certain creatures to be hanging out in these places. If you wonder, well, why is this creature always by this particular mountain? Maybe that's why. It uses that elemental plane of air connection. And so this is a portal. It makes it a very strong, powerful place. Maybe certain magics are more intense where you can call upon the power of the elemental plane of air. And it's right there. Boom. Maybe that does something. So there could be reasons to make these places either very dangerous, very potent, or both, or just interesting. And I don't mean to just say it doesn't have to be just be water, air. You could have what kind of features might a connection to the elemental plane of fire operate, right? Obviously, it could be volcanoes would probably be, right, the obvious one. There could be an interesting interaction, maybe something like geysers could be where there's a connection that goes to the plane of water and the plane of fire at the same time, and so you get these superheated things. Because these are fantasy worlds. We're not really concerned, at least I'm not, about physical, real-world plate tectonics and all that kind of jazz and the heating of the mantle and all this stuff. I'm not in, the volcanology. To me, geysers could easily be, hey, there's one portal or maybe two portals converged, so you get fire, you get water, and then that creates the kind of geyser effect. I don't know what the physics are. Maybe that's nonsense. It's our nonsense. It's our worlds. That's how it happens. People love to take tunnels and caves and say, ooh, they go down the Underdark, but maybe they could go down into the elemental plane of Earth instead, or maybe in addition to, or maybe you get, that's kind of a progression, cave entrance, Underdark, elemental plane of Earth. Really a lot of great possibilities there, and if you need reasons for certain creatures to be there, right, we're always looking through the monster manual thinking, well, how do these things get there? Why would there be a Zorn over here? I don't know. Well, maybe there is a connection there with the elemental plane of Earth, and that's how some of these creatures migrate through periodically. That is how they get here. That's how if you're wondering maybe why some things disappear, right, kind of Bermuda Triangle type effect. Could be anywhere. Why? How did all these things keep going into this one area and they don't seem to come out again? Could be that there are these elemental connections there, or to other planes. I'm just using the elements because I think they're really neat, and I think they're underutilized. I feel like as far as everyone wants to go and explore the ethereal plane and the different outer planes, but I feel like the elemental planes have a lot to offer, and they're fairly easy. They're not all super high level. You could just have earth elementals and of different sizes and things, and powerful ones, but they're also kind of weaker elemental creatures that you can populate. It could be all kinds of reasons for stuff. So I just feel like that they have this underused utility. But again, you could have, what if there was some kind of, for whatever reason, a connection to one of the planes of hell somewhere. One, what might that do to the landscape around it, right? Think about that. If you're in an area and it's very desolate, it's maybe desolate, blighted, could seem kind of cursed, could seem like it's, just blighted, cursed, just kind of dead. Everything is maybe mutated in sort of, evil ways. That the creatures that are there are just fiercer and nastier and crazier. And then when you get to where this actual connection is, what might that look like? Maybe it looks, again, it could be like a pool of just like yucky mud. Maybe it's also on fire. You could think about what we think of, however in your world, we think your concept of what the hells look like. How might that, when it's sort of peeling and coming through this thing, what demons might be there? How might they want to protect us? Because you think of demons and devils, they're trying to influence the material plane, potentially in your setting. Maybe they're trying to outright conquer the material plane. These natural connections probably aren't strong enough to let, the big demons through, but smaller ones, and maybe they're trying to take it and then reinforce it and strengthen it and pull it open wider until they can get that. That could be a whole, campaign right there. Is there are these holes that go to the hells, and maybe they're creating more of them. Maybe they are trying to make them bigger, and then obviously at the end of it, Orcus or Demogorgon or somebody's going to come flying through, so we got to stop it before this happens, right? A lot of possibilities there. I wanted to point out one module that I've never really run it, but I own it, obviously. I'm about to show it to you. That really opened my eyes in a way to the concept of having these elemental planar connections is Test of the Warlords by Douglas Niles. It was a companion mobile adventure for the BECMI version of D&D rules, and they have a lot going on. So this is you can see it's level 15 and above, not for the small level characters, but it features a big hex map. So there's a lot going on there, and it's got a couple of neat things. And I should do I'll probably do a read through of this at some point, because I do find it kind of fascinating, even though I haven't actually played it myself. It's got some really cool things. There's this whole storm giant incursion. Not storm giant, was it storm giant? Some kind of giant incursion. Why am I spacing out on which ones? I'm trying to remember which ones, but basically these whole giants have an incursion into the lands that you have to deal with. And it has, somewhere in here is a planar connection. Let's see if it says, is it the volcano? Can't remember where exactly it is, but there is one of these planar connections that seems super fascinating. And it basically is in a hex map type layout, so you're meant to explore and do that. But it had a really cool thing. But that idea of having this elemental connection there really kind of opened my eyes, because I thought about it. I said, yeah, well, there should be natural connections to these different planes. And if they're there, well, how do they interact with the world? What might come through? What possibilities does that have? You could think of countless kinds of creatures and factions that might want to control some of these different connections if they can find them, right? They might be A, trying to find them, either B, trying to close them, open them wider, maybe just control them. There could be a whole political angle to that. What resources might be in the plane of war. So for example, if you were playing in, say, a desert type situation, and maybe there was a particular oasis that was particularly lush, particularly bountiful with light, but super hidden in the desert. What if one of the reasons why that was able to exist in that kind of environment was because it had the central pool at the center of this oasis was a connection to the elemental plane of water, so essentially would ever fill. How powerful and meaningful is controlling that oasis? I mean, it's everything, right? Who wouldn't want to have that? That water being the biggest resource that you can have in a desert. Everybody would want it if they can find it. And you can even think about, maybe if you're someone who likes to homebrew things, maybe you could think of some items or abilities or class features that are all around finding these natural planar connections and manipulating them somehow. I think other editions, they had Planeswalker. I know that's something out of, not Pokemon, Magic the Gathering, but I kind of feel like there used to be some more planar abilities and class features. I can't remember. Obviously, fill me in on the notes if I'm either misremembering and it's getting munged up in my brain, or if you remember that. But I could certainly see something where if you're going to want to make this a main feature in your campaigns, that you could have class features that revolve around doing stuff with these planar connections. Maybe being able to really temporarily open them up. Obviously that's planar, that kind of rolls over with planar travel, but you could think about how you might progress, right? So maybe you could open up these little connections, but they don't allow travel until you reach a certain level, in which case they do. You could do some interesting things, like what if you could do sort of a firebolt type effect but instead of it being a spell where you're conjuring fire, you're literally opening up a little pinhole into the plane of fire, and fire would jet out and strike somebody, right? That could be something. And then maybe it elevates from there into something else. And you think about, maybe at, third, fifth, sixth level, you can do something a little different. Maybe it can be more of a fireball type effect, right? Where you're opening up sort of a one-way path where you're just dumping fire out of the plane of fire into people. So essentially it's not dissimilar from a fireball. It could basically be just a re-flavored version of the spell, but essentially it has that planar connection, boom, and then later on maybe it does allow you to travel fire. And you can get some resistances to fire thrown in there. You could really have a lot of fun with making sort of a plane of fire Planeswalker, or I don't know what other, Planeswalker is such a cool word. I don't know what else it would be. Planes Traveler, I don't know, planes, something to do with the planes, right? You have some affinity for the planes, whatever you want to call that. So some interesting things there, but just getting back, let me step back out of the rabbit hole of planes. The idea overall is to look at your hex map and think about in different areas that you might feel are just vast and unchanging, to throw in these any sort of, again, unusual, unique, strange, mysterious elements, depending on how gonzo or, earthbound your campaign is. Maybe you want to have a ton of them. Maybe you want to have not too many. Obviously, you probably don't want to just, if you're doing kind of top-down world building, you probably don't want to have to populate all that at once. So you could look at where your party is likely to go and then pepper them up. You could use a table. If I had that grove of red delirium, I could come up with maybe 20 of those, 10. I could roll on a table and see what comes up and then sprinkle them kind of in their path or off to the side. Maybe you just see it in the distance and they can choose to do it. Maybe it ends up in their path and they decide to go around or not. They don't have to be static. Mine obviously was a terrain effect. It could be particular creatures. It could be a particular layer. It could be something that just the area, right? I had one area where a party I was jamming for went through where there was kind of mists that flowed in, and when the mists came in, kind of like the movie The Fog, there were sort of spirits would activate, but they were reliving a battle from the past. So if you didn't interact with them, they weren't going to attack you or do anything, but it was all about this kind of temptation to interact. And do you do that and then you're kind of in it, or do you avoid it and don't? And they chose to avoid it, which was probably the smarter play. There would have been some rewards for them if they would have done it, just in terms of things that were there to be had. But probably for them, it was smarter. They pass it by. But that's another something that could be one of these interesting effects. So you have all these things you could throw into your hex map to make it more than just, boring, or I'm just going to hand wave it all. Right, throw some cool, interesting things in there. I would caution. Obviously, my own personal style of gaming is not particularly gonzo. I enjoy it on occasion. I think kind of a one shot, but generally I'm not. And one thing I found, I was playing in a game, someone was running Electric Bastion Land. They were running it, and I haven't read. I forget the name of the rules that's with, but I haven't really read all that much of it, and particularly not how. I haven't read the blog stuff, and I haven't read how Bastion Land is supposed to be laid out. But essentially, the guidance that the GM was following was essentially kind of every little area had something going on in it, and he was really leaning into that. But what it found for me was there. I guess what I'm saying is I feel like for me, and maybe for others as well, there's kind of you reach a tipping point where you just get saturated and then oversaturated. So what happened was that we were in the city and we were tasked with, we had to get down into this sewer area to try to find something. And I felt like we couldn't just step 5 feet without just something happening that we had to interact with. And they usually were kind of in the way of just getting in our way. They were just obstacles or weird stuff. Well, one of them was a truck full of molasses just spilled out. Now the guards are looking for passes. Now they're doing that. And individually, those were all great things. And those would all individually fall into that same category of, okay, we're just moving through the city. That's boring. Right? So if we're not going to, either we hand wave it and say you move to where you're going, or we need to figure out some ways of making it interesting. One or two of those, right? You think of, okay, that's good. But there's just, for me anyway, I just reached a point where I just had too much. And I think I said out of character, I was like, oh my gosh, can we please just get to the where we want to go? Because the sewers is not the end of the adventure. It's just the beginning of the adventure. And it just felt like we were just going around and around. Like, I just want to cross the street. I just want to get down this block. Oh gosh, can I not walk a block in the street without something crazy happening? To me, I felt like we were suddenly thrust in, Toontown from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It's just every time you turn a corner, something just wacky's happening. And it just reached that point where, one, wasn't familiar with Bastion Land at that moment, and I'm still not overly familiar with it. So I didn't have an expectation of what the city was supposed to be like. And two, it just had gotten past the point of being like, okay, this is interesting. It feels like a unique place that's moving around and active and, diverse and dynamic. It just felt like I just can't get 5 feet down the street. I just felt like and I know it wasn't his intention, it just felt like, okay, now the GM's just throwing blocks in there just to, kind of almost just to be a jerk. It just felt to me just viscerally like, oh, what is this dude doing? Why are they doing this to me? I just want to get across the street and I can't. So you want to be careful with that. Know what the expectations of your group are, right? If when I do hex crawling kind of wilderness exploration, I make sure that the party is really aware of what they're getting into in terms of resource usage, in terms of time that may be spent, in terms of the challenges they're going to face, so that they know that if they're going to undertake this expedition of a week's travel to this other place, that it's going to be kind of involved. If your group thinks they're going in and you're just going to hand wave it and maybe one a day roll for an encounter, and then you're just going to do a couple rolls, you're going to be there, and suddenly you're just throwing all this stuff in front of them, it might rub them the wrong way. And the other point is, make sure it fits within the tone of the world you're saying. I said before that if you just throw everything like Bastion Land did, it's a very gonzo experience. I didn't know I was in for a super gonzo experience like that, so it frustrated me because it wasn't my expectation. If your world is super gonzo, great, just throw it all in there. Have every hex have something other crazy going on. If you're running something that's more toned down, make sure that you keep it to that toned down state. So just maybe have one every, I don't know, every day of travel, maybe even every 2 days of travel, 3 days of travel. Space it out, because we don't want, you know, for me, I like these, for me, what makes some of these things interesting, for me, what makes the Grove of Red Delirium interesting is that it will stand out from the rest of what's going on to make it either that like, oh gosh, we should stay away from it, or ooh, I want to check it out, but that it stands out from the rest of the habitat. If everything is kind of crazy, then sort of nothing kind of stands out anymore, or it's much harder to throw some and say, hey, look at me, I'm interesting, because everything is just a kaleidoscope of colors. But that's just me. Again, you may have something different, and of course you can just keep upping the ante every time you go around. And as far as inspiration, there's tons of it, from kind of Jack and the Beanstalk and those kind of fairy tale things where you end up with, you know, human-sized stuff. Suddenly you have maybe a valley or a mountain. Everything is giant-sized, or vice versa. Everything is shrunken down, and they're giants. That's an interesting feature, interesting area that you can have fun with. Certainly there's the kind of both comedic stuff of, well, how do you deal with that if either the players are giants or now they're really tiny in this area compared to everything else. And it makes things that might not have been challenging before super challenging. The little peasant that the players just might have like picked off, now they're 50 foot tall and they're a super big threat. Or just the cockroaches and the rats and the mice and the things that live in this area, right? We think about it in the real world where they found bones of tiny elephants because they were on islands and everything shrunk, and then the rats got huge. You could have a lot of fun with that. Fairy tales are great inspiration. Of course, I just mentioned there are real world examples of things. The real world might have some inspiration. You could even have, I think there's a Lamentations of the Flame Princess, I forget which book module they have, where you enter in a valley and it kind of, it's like a pocket dimension or a little demi-plane, not unlike Barovia, that they could walk into and have to figure out how to get out of. That could be another one. It could be a little mini adventure if you need some kind of filler and you want it to be something that you want the players to experience. I like to usually give them some kind of choice, but of course it's very easy to misread the signs if you want to be a little bit sneaky, and you know, class choices are going to matter there. Maybe a ranger in the party would have figured out that, oh, this isn't right, we shouldn't go down in this valley, even though it looks nice, but they don't have a ranger, so it's hard for them and they miss it. You know, be careful with that stuff. You don't want to feel like too much you're just trying to throw them in something, but you know, you have some things to play with there. But there's lots of inspiration out there, ways to kind of add some pepper, add a little spice, right? Get some hot pepper flakes thrown on there, throw something to give your hexes some flavor. But hey, enjoy that Red Delirium, Grove Red Delirium. Again, the link to the Patreon, which has a free PDF. It's not gated behind anything. It'll be in the show notes. Let me know what you think about that. If you have any comments about it, questions, things that aren't clear, or if you just want to say, hey, this is great, or hey, it stinks, you can let me know in the comments. And please, if you like this stuff, obviously, always, you know, if you want to give me a thumbs up, I appreciate it. Hit subscribe. There's that little bell thingy if you want to get notified. That's all great too. But be safe, be healthy, game on, and I'll talk to you later.